thank you for coming. So first of all, web-based applications are kind of like little mini Frankensteins, right? How many of you have written apps that just kind of get away from you, right? Everyone's going to raise their hand because we've all done npm install, right? And then we've all gone on vacation or gone to another project, and then someone else comes in and logs in with, these are all dead projects. But it reminds me of the days of Rails. Ruby on Rails, very, very popular for the time. It was as popular as it was for like a good 5 years. There were a lot of people who did a ton of Rails development, started a lot of projects, and then you pick up a Rails project 4 or 5 years later, and half the projects you use in it are dead. You try to upgrade to Rails from 2 to 3, and it's a horror show. So there's a lot going on with open source developers adding libraries all the time. So that is always a concern. But in terms of React itself, I think it's safe to say that if you stick with React itself, you're in pretty good shape. The big question is, how do you control yourself and not have so many libraries to which you're working on? So yeah, React is really no exception here. So we're going to start talking first about whether, what's going on with React, what the React team is doing. Talk a little bit about the community process. Every 6 months or so, you hear that React is dead, and someone writes a blog post about it. You look at the GitHub commits, there's stuff going on. So, all right. So first of all, let's take a look at the release cycle here, right? We're in 2024. They have a conference in May. I'm pretty sure they're going to show off React 19 in May or be close to being done with at least the alpha of React 19. It's no worse than when we went from functional components to React hooks with functional components when Dan Abramov came on board. So I think we're still in that phase of they're just getting a lot of stuff ready to go. But there are some things that are kind of impinging on that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Some things that are making it a little more difficult to move forward. So all the RFCs are out there, and they're on GitHub for everyone to view. And if I know how to use a mouse, which will be fascinating, let's see here. This is harder than it looks. There they are. Now, a lot of these RFCs you see here are from people who are contributors for the first time, or they're submitting a particular patch request. They're suggesting that you want the spec to change a little bit, and can you please fix this? And a lot of them sit there for a long time. So they have their priorities, and these may or may not line up to those priorities. Also, the request for comments, the React team themselves don't necessarily put everything they work on in RFCs. So if they're working on features for React 19, you're not going to see each feature in here. It's not like that level of traceability that I was able to find. But for things they feel they want debate on and discussion about, and I've seen the React team do this around things like React server components, there are several RFCs for that. And there's vigorous debate in those RFCs. So first of all, things are going on. That's always good. And there's a fair amount of work being done here. You can also see all the ones that were closed and why. Dig into each of those if you need to. You can also see, and we're going to have a test at the end of this. Who knows what number now? But you can see that over time from 2014 on the left to 2024, React code base is getting larger. The commits are getting larger, larger numbers of commits. Some of the people that do the most commits right now are people like Andrew Clark and Brian Vaughn, thank you, Dan Abramov, a number of others. Some work for Meta, some work for other companies. But there's a lot going on, and there has been. So if you take a look at the main branch on React on Facebook's Git, things are going on. So React isn't really dead. It's just that I think people sometimes wish it was. Just like every other framework, everybody says it's sick and tired of it after a while, and they want to move on to something new. And I think that's part of what's going on. So the reports of my death have been premature, says React. And developers are like, hold on a second. There are a few things we need to think about. Remember, React is only these little blue things here, right? A component with props and state and context and those APIs. But to do anything in a React application, you have to do a lot of a selection of other things. How are you doing your form validation, right? What are you doing about networking? Are you doing anything with a state store, for example? How are you doing your CSS? There's a whole bunch of choices for how you do your CSS libraries. Are you using Sass, or are you using CSS and JavaScript, or using Tailwind or something like that? You know, all sorts of decisions. Testing libraries, that's another interesting one. You know, you have things like, we originally had Enzyme for component tests. And Enzyme ran a virtual DOM, or it ran a browser DOM to run your tests. And then React Test Library came along and rewrote the way we write testing in React. So if you're component testing, most people now are looking at, instead of Enzyme, they're using React Test Library. We were using Jest for testing for the test runner. Now all of a sudden people are starting to use VI test or Vitest from the Vite project. People used to use Create React App. Now we're all using Vite. So all this stuff keeps rolling along. How many of you that are doing React work put in time in your projects to check what's going on and make sure that your libraries are up to date? Show of hands. That's a good thing, a couple of you. I think without mentioning that, if you don't do that on your project team and you have a large React project, you really should. And speaking as a consultant who has come in and helped out projects that were kind of asleep for a while and woke up again, a lot of them have strange problems like that. So for example, one of my clients had a React component library they were using that was based on material design. They created their components, and right after they created their components, about a year later, that library sunsetted in 2018, I believe it was. You come back to it in like 2022, I think was when I was doing this project, and all of a sudden you've had a dead library for 4 years, and you just found out. And they used it everywhere, so what do you do, right? So that's the kind of thing you want to avoid. So if you can bake in some time, you know, every 6 months to a year or so for somebody to do a spike to research and see what's going on with your React libraries. Make sure they're all going, you know, and they're being committed to. Make sure they didn't sunset and give up on their developers. It's not a bad thing. The other refrain you'll hear, and I don't blame you, is React keeps changing on me. Every time I go to code React, there's a new way to do this, right? We went from plain old classes, which if you're Java programmer, hey, classes, this made sense, right? We have classes in a life cycle to pure functional components, and then we had hooks for those. Then we started talking about server rendering, and that's when, at that point in time, we started getting into meta frameworks and server rendering. That's when we started getting away from just Meta doing the work on React. It wasn't just them anymore, right? We had companies like Vercel and a Remix getting involved with their frameworks. But you can still use all these prior approaches. They generally try to keep it backward compatible as much as they can. Certainly, if you can rewrite some things to take advantage of better performing items, great. But you don't have to jump on every brand new fad, obviously, says the old guy up front. Upgrade when you're ready, slowly convert things. For example, you can convert your class-based React components to functional components with hooks. You don't have to do them all at once. You don't have to do all of them, but you can. And if, let's say you're suddenly using React context for data that's shared, and you want to take advantage of that and you have a few class components, you can get the class components to get access to the context until you can convert them over to functional. So it just requires planning more than anything else. And too many ways to do things, which we kind of talked about before, right? Too many APIs, too many libraries. And that's because React is a toolkit, right? Its whole point when it came out, I think the meta developers really, or Facebook at the time, they wanted to have a nice little toolkit to deal with views, rendering views, and handling components in the view layer. They didn't want it to do everything else. And for the most part, that's been what it was until about 2 or 3 years ago when it started getting more and more into how do I handle a server and things like that. So by design, it's meant to be that you kind of create your own bespoke platform every time you use React to some degree. Now you can pick some starters, but I never see someone use the same one twice, including myself. Mostly Create React App and then Vite were the ones I've been using a couple of years. But yeah, you kind of pick the tools you need and install them and go there. So I think that sometimes leads to enough churn mentally where you're thinking to yourself, if I have to build one more platform from scratch, I'm going to lose my mind. Whereas if you were using something like Angular, Angular is an all-in-one tool framework, and it figured out how to do networking animations and everything else you're going to do with it. But that comes at a cost of a heavier footprint, right? So I think a lot of companies looked at that and said, yeah, it seems very enterprisey. So we're going to drop enterprise from the name, like emerging technologies for the enterprise, and switch to East. No, and so maybe looking at something a little bit more simple and lightweight to work with, and integrate what you want into just that small core API. And my favorite line from Keith Gregory at Chariot is, "You ain't gonna need it." Whenever I'm talking about something, he's like, "Do you really need it, Yagni?" I'm like, "Probably don't," but it's true. I mean, use what you need to use, but then the more you use, the more likely something's gonna hit you later and be dead. So, emerging features you should be suspect of, because they will change a couple times by the time they're released. So, none of this is brand new to any of you, I'm sure, in this room. Deadlines equal pressure, and that's sometimes just makes you make decisions you have to make at the time and pick libraries you have to pick. So let's just kind of put to bed the concept of React is dying or dead. If you look at the market out there and people who are working in industry, there's a whole lot of people doing React. Less people doing things like Svelte or Angular or whatever. Angular still has a pretty decent following just because the enterprise has picked a lot of Angular. But some of the newer libraries, you're going to find less people who know it. There's less of a community. And if something does take over, pay attention to it, obviously I would. But right now, React kind of fits in that sweet spot. So let's look at what they're doing on the React team right now, what they're focusing on. We'll start with some features of React 19. Then we'll talk about the React compiler and server components. Those are the three major things that they've been working on. All right. The one that I think has bothered some of my compadres at Chariot a bit is the form action. And that's because if you take a look at what they're doing here, the form tag, React does everything with synthetic events, like on, submit, on, whatever, they're React-based wrapper events, right? But now they said, we're going to want to support running functions as actions, both synchronously and asynchronously, and on the client and on a server. So the tag you use in HTML is action, right? The attribute of the tag. And ultimately, from what I've read, I'm not sure about this, but I've read this from one person at Vercel. They were saying that if you do a server rendered form, they actually rewrite the action as an HTML link. So when it comes down to the client, it actually looks like regular plain old HTML if you've turned off your JavaScript and you're doing like the lo-fi client. So the goal is to make it more act like HTML. So that's what they're focusing on. But form action runs a function. Again, it could be local or it could be remote. And there are mechanisms for doing these that I'll show you. The interesting thing about the action is they give you a form data object. And the form data object is a standard web JavaScript object for regular JavaScript and HTML form integration. Now, if you've done a lot of React, hey, I put things in state. I'm just going to get my state value, and I'm going to put that in the thing I'm going to ship up, and I send it. And if I'm doing client-side, sorry, I'm going to make that crazy. If I'm doing client-side React, I have access to the state of the form. I can just get it. But if this form is going to be shipped to the server, server components, as we'll see, don't have state, right? And server actions don't have state. They all get a form data object. And now everything that gets a form data object can go get on a field name and get the value. So they're trying to standardize the way you do both client and server interactions long term. So on the client side, you look at it and go, yeah, I could have just gotten that from the state object. But it's really meant for like asynchronous things that eventually resolve and for server-side things. And so that's one of the new features of React 19. First of all is to make an action and then give you the form data. Here's an example of an async form data method. Async action. And so we have our async actions going to get its form data, and it's going to do whatever it's going to do asynchronous, like a fetch, right? We're going to await a fetch and get an answer back. And if we bring things back, we can grab the context and bring it back again and see the result if we want to. But yeah, so you can do an asynchronous function as an action in React 19. Now, a couple other nice little features. Now that we get to form actions, we now have a hook called useFormStatus. And the useFormStatus has several variables that it brings back. Any component nested within my form can just call this hook, and they'll get access to whether the form is being currently submitted, which is the pending flag. They'll get access to the data, which is, guess what, a form data object. So now I can grab the data and introspect it if I need to. They get access to the method that was being called and the reference to the action itself, the function. So this example here, I'm just using a simple functional component. I've got a smart button. I'm giving it a label and a pending label for when I click it. I want to change the label to like processing or something like that. And the button is going to have a disabled prop that's based on the pending flag. So the minute I click submit, this thing will go disabled. It will be grayed and grayed out because I'm using Tailwind to change the disabled text to gray 500. So it'll visually look disabled and it won't be able to be clicked. And then I can do a ternary to determine what label to show. So, and I did all of that without actually having to hook into the parent form directly or pass a prop down to the component for that information. I can just pass the one for the label itself, and that's all I care about. So it's a nice feature, I think. Another feature is the use hook. All middleware basically is use something or other, right? You can add state or context or manipulate things. Now they have a use hook that just generically will update when the promise that it has resolves. So anything you can build with a promise, you can call as middleware, right, as hook code with use. That's a nice feature. We're starting to get here in the next one into what happens when we have integration with a company that has a product around React. So Vercel in Next.js, which is their product, the server-side rendering app server, they have these special tags they had for a while that you could mount for very early on in their frameworks, like title and meta and link. So you import those components, usually the capital instead of the lowercase here. And when you import those components and you you mount title and put a title in your component, it will bubble up and change the title of the page. If you mount the link tag for them, it will go ahead and load that JavaScript asynchronously. So that's what those are for, and meta will change your meta tags. So that was a Next.js feature, and that's now wound its way into React as a feature for React 19. So we're starting to see a little bit of that integration. Another thing they did in React 18 is they added a suspense component, and the suspense component you can actually mount around anything that runs asynchronously that uses a suspenseful data fetching, like Tanstack query or React query or whatever. As long as it supports it, it'll automatically let you show some sort of fallback, like loading or a spinner when things are happening asynchronously. They've extended that in React 19 to include waiting on style sheet changes, so you don't recalculate your views too often, and font loading and script tags. They can all await suspense as well. So it'll be a little more consistent, where the scripts and fonts and style sheets won't pop in before the data pops in. So it's pretty handy. They've claimed there's some new internal APIs for preloading and pre-init setup. I haven't looked at those yet, but that's kind of on deck. And React Server Components. So React Server Components are part of it, and that's what we're going to get into. Now, how might you get access to React 19 today? Well, either you wait 3 or 4 weeks and see whether the alpha shows up and use that, or for now you can use a React Canary. So let me just bring this up here. I'll bring this screen over. It's coming over somehow because I full screened it. Points if I can figure this out. There we go. Yay! I can do this. Anyway. So the React team has a Canary changelog in the project. And they've released a couple of them, but they just released one, I think, in February. And that's 18.3.0 Canary, this long thing. It's actually for 19, but they didn't want to bump the major version up yet because some things might depend on it. So you mount React and React DOM with those. And I have to fix this one in this particular file. I believe the types are now starting to come from the React team. I have to double check that. But you may have problems if you import types React and React DOM of 18 because it's going to be something else. So I have to double check on that. But the bottom line is, when you do this, you are now using whatever features they've released to the Canary that are React 19 features. So when I was playing around with the form actions, they were all available to me. The new hooks were available to me, and it worked. I would not put this in production because it's not released. It's canaried. But you know what the funny thing is Vercel, being so closely integrated with the React team, they released Vercel's Next.js 14 using the canary tag. So they're actually using canary in their builds. They feel pretty confident about it, I guess. You know, maybe they're pretty close to release. But 14 is using that canary build we're looking at right there. All right. Let's jump ahead of everything else we were talking about, kind of get this one out of the way, and we'll talk about the React compiler. So right now, the team is working on a compiler that will take a pass through the code. Now, how many of you have used React Lazy and Memo and things like that to curb performance issues? So the idea is you do that, right? You do that so that you don't pre-render or you don't render too many times. If the things coming into the component haven't changed, don't re-render my component. The problem is it's manual, right? You have to do it yourself. And so what the team is trying to do is they're trying to make it so they just go through everything and look at all the references and they wrap your code with the Memo and Lazy, whatever they need to do behind the scenes for you. So it's kind of like a meta compiler, whatever you want to call it, that runs over top of it and optimizes your code for when it builds. And the goal would be for you to never have to write another React Memo or Lazy or a use callback again. So you let them do it for you, which I think kind of makes some sense because you just have to do a lot of it. And you're never sure whether, unless you do a lot of good scientific rigorous testing, you're not entirely sure whether you should be doing that. You shouldn't be pre-optimizing. So was it really effective? It may or may not be, but let them do that for you. And then to take advantage of it, you can start pulling out your memoization code if you want to. We'll see how that goes. So the whole point of React is put a front end against something and get to some data, right? It's a server world out there, and we have to fetch data, and we have to integrate with data feeds. Lots of different sources coming in. And we need quick loading and interactivity on the page. So these meta frameworks, like Next.js and Remix Run, and before that Gatsby and some others, they're all taking care of the server-side rendering and server optimizations for you, and they've all been doing it pretty much their own way. If you take a look at Next.js and Remix Run next to each other, they're two different platforms. They have a lot of similarities. They both use a directory structure for the router. So you have literally a hierarchical directory structure, and the structure has the path of the URL as part of the structure. Even the parameter names are kind of stuffed in there as properties of directories, things like that. They generally provide server-side rendering as a feature, which means if you hit a component that's marked for server-side rendering, it will run the server component on the server first, ship a very lightweight version of it for rendering and display, and then mount the component and have it do its thing again. Right? So you get a quick time for interactivity. You see it come up, you see the data flick up, and then it starts loading the rest of the React app around it. You can also usually go from place to place by physically hitting the links, which means you can bookmark everything. And the SEO works well because you can crawl those things with search engines and it will actually give you the information for each of the links on the page. Whereas with routers, it's hard to do that. Regular like client-side routing, like React Router. It's difficult to do. They also, some of them, support static site generation and static page generation. So for those, you mark some pages for generated automatically. You can have it at build time go through and run whatever queries you put on the setup of the page to pre-render pages for you. So Gatsby was the first one to do that I remember. I'm sure there was ones before, but that was the most popular one at first. And then Next.js came out with that. as well. The Remix team didn't really want to work on that. They felt that server rendering is better and that static site generation is kind of a hack. And you have to rebuild it. It takes time. So one of the other things that the team over at Vercel did was the incremental site generation, which means they let you kind of dynamically at runtime generate links as you hit them, and they cache those on files. But these are all, again, custom solutions. So what they've been trying to do on the React team is find some sort of standard for some of these things. And the first standard they came up with was React Server Components. So, in a world, it's like a movie, in a world, fiercely independent users of this toolkit, with vendors who innovate on their own terms and no preordained way to start with, Meta published an RFC. They did one in 2020, and then they did another one in 2022 to kind of amend it. And those are the two RFCs that they build up server components from. Those RFCs are approved. They're part of the code base, and they're shipping as part of React 19. If your vendor goes to React 19, that code's going to be there. Now, if you just purely use React on the client side, you're not going to use those features. And if the vendor that you're using, like Remix, doesn't support all of React 19, that's going to get interesting. So this is an inflection point. This is the thing to pay attention to over the next couple of months is what are companies that aren't going to React 19 going to do? I know the answer, but I know that currently, from what I've read in posts from the Remix team, they want to hold back and wait a bit because they feel like the spec isn't where they want it to be for what they want to support for server components. So I have links. I'm going to give you a QR code at the end. You can download this presentation with a ton of links and all the content in there. So you can take a look at those later. But you can see all the back and forth and the communications and debate. They do it in the open, which is good. And we'll have to see what happens. I mean, they kind of, the world got ahead of them, and now they're trying to pull it back a little bit. So that's where the challenge is right now with React. We'll see where that goes. So now the choices, and I don't have any room for my layout to do this right. Now the choices, that we had before include, what am I going to do for these server-side things? Am I going to use a vendor? Sure, I'm going to have to use some vendor because I can't do it myself. What if I have, Java on the back end or something other than Node? Well, I can't really use this. Or I can use a very thin server-side platform, but now I got to license that, and I have to use it as a back end for a front end. Do I want to do that? You don't necessarily have to. So you may or may not care about this part of it. And if you don't care about the the Next.js or React server component side of it, none of this really affects you. Because you'll just still do the same thing you've been doing before. You'll hit your Java backend server, your Python backend server, the same way you did with client APIs. So it's really just in that Node.js world. Are you going to use that feature or not? So let's look a little bit about this, how this works. So I'll show you some code in a minute. So a server component, you remember the directives in JavaScript where you used to say use strict? Remember that? You quote use strict, and it turns on the strict ECMAScript 5 checking, right? Now we have use server and use client. They went back to that syntax. So the first line, keep hitting this thing. I'm spastic today. There we go, stay there. So the first line of your script, generally, or in front of a class file or a function, can be like use server or use client, depending on what you're trying to do. And that tells the compiler to code split it so that if it's a client thing, it can provide it as a script to download, or it can do things on the server side where it needs to. The default is server component in Next.js. And I only have one reference implementation to work with. Next.js is the one I know that works, that does React server components. So I'm kind of at a loss to show you two of them because no one else has said, yep, we're ready and here's our version of React server components yet. Now, React server components can't hold state. They can't run hooks. They can run scripts before they mount, like in the beginning when they mount, but they're not hooks, right? So if you hit a link and in that link the component does a database call to an actual database in Node.js, it can do that, but you're not doing it in a hook. You're just running that as part of the rendering process. And it renders it, ships it to the client, and quickly mounts it. Client components, you annotate with use client. And those do get shipped to the client side, and they get loaded up and started on the desktop, on your browser. Now, they can do everything a client component normally could do. You could do your hooks, you could do your state, go crazy, context, whatever you want to do. You could fetch data the same way you always have. So there's no limitation to a client component. I'm curious, though, I'm hoping we don't have to put use client in every single component file if we don't want to use Next.js. Maybe, I don't know. You used to be able to basically name the files a certain way in early versions of the React server-side components ideas, but they nixed that early on. They decided to use these directives instead. So we'll have to see how that plays out long term. The other thing you could do is you can embed a client component within a server component, and it will ship it down to do the rendering and the smart stuff, right? But their thinking is most things you do, and it depends on the app you write, but their feeling was a lot of things you do in an app are stateless, boilerplate around menus and things like that. Things that are not hard to like re-render without holding state, if you have to. So their default mode in this thinking is server, and you go out of your way to make something a client component. Another interesting thing is, if let's say you're doing a server component and that server component is generating a graph or doing database query to a backend that you can't have access to because it's behind the firewall, they don't include that bundle in your client. So you don't get that JavaScript shipped to you because you're not using it on the client side. So that's another thing that's beneficial. If you want the client to be nice and lightweight, any work you're doing on the server, the libraries that are server-specific Node.js libraries don't get shipped down because they're not being used in a client component. They won't be bundled for the client. They'll just run on the server side. So that's a benefit of that. If you put them in client, now they get shipped down. Right? So it's not like you have to go out of your way to turn it off. It's just if none of your components use a library except server components, they're just part of the stuff that runs on the server, and they don't get shipped as part of the footprint that you get as a client. All right, let me just mirror my display here. OK, what I have here is I've got a couple projects. The first one is the React 19 demo, just to show you. I'll make sure I zip this up and put this in the directory for you to play around with as well. This is using canaries, and so I went to the README for the React project and read the canary and picked the current one. And I have links to the white papers where you can find out all the information about how to find the canaries and use them, and the development process and everything else. So I'm out of React and React DOM. Let's see. There's that smart button. Right? And we're not talking about React Server at all right now. We're just running this in Vite. So if I run this thing in Vite, it should be running now. Really exciting stuff here. So I'm running React. It is slow because they're simulating a server trip. So they're like going to sleep and waking something up randomly. But so we're running React with some of these new features. So if I go to the cart component, it's just rendering a collection of cart objects that I'm holding on to. And they're added through the add to cart form. So this is a component that has a form in it, and it's using a form action. Here's the form action being used. It's local to the component, so it's just a function. And they're doing an async function here. And I believe the add to cart thing is where they do the little sleep and then resolve the promise. So mechanically, it's not much different. We're not really using a form. I'll show you the actual data of the form, but if you want to get stuff out of it, you could just say formData.get and give it the property name that you want. Pluck it out of the form, do what you want to do. Now, just out of curiosity here, let's look at our page source. That didn't help. I'll inspect. That's better. Why wouldn't I do that? Inspect. Let's take a look at what's going on here in the form. They actually have a throw error in the form. Interesting. So a little magic going on in there. So they want your API to call it through action. They don't want you to just like trigger it through a regular JavaScript click that then directly submits the form. So something intercepts it in React to make sure you're not directly submitting the form in this case. Okay. Here's that smart button for you. Okay, we saw that before, so that's sitting there. And make sure that works. I'm not sure I saw that go gray. Oh, it did. You saw the label change, and you can't click it. There you go. So, you know, useful information. And if I just do a console dir of data and maybe include it in my code, would help, wouldn't it? There we go. So there's your form data object being included for you automatically by React. I feel like they did this after the Remix team did their real big push to using web standard objects. So for example, the Remix run team, they use fetch on the server side, which the Remix team does now, or the Next.js team does now. They use the form data object, and they use like request response. All this stuff was a standard Mozilla spec, JavaScript spec. And then Next.js kind of came along and they did the same thing. So they're lapping each other to a degree and like improving on each other's work, that's not a bad thing. Okay. And again, this is the thing you got to watch for long term, is this interaction with the different companies. So long term, I mean, every framework you work with to some degree gets bigger and bigger at some point. Minus Spring, we're safe with Spring. But in general, like a lot of them just kind of morph into a larger thing and get bought by a company and things change. Currently Shopify owns the Remix Run project. They bought them out last summer, I think it was. So now that's part of a company. Gatsby just closed down their Gatsby Cloud and is telling everyone to go on to, who was that? Netlify, right? To go to Netlify's official cloud. And they're just kind of letting you still use Gatsby as an open source project, but they're not serving it anywhere. So they don't dog food it anymore, or they won't. So things change, right? Stars die. It's not possible to assume that everything's going to live forever. But this is something to keep an eye on. We'll have to see where React goes and whether maybe the Remix team forks and does their own thing going forward. I kind of think that might be what they do, because they're fiercely independent. So be aware of this. Keep an eye on this stuff. And so what about React server components? Well, I can tell you that the biggest problem I've had so far with React server components, besides A, it's not released. That's a slight issue. It's in Canary, so it's like the docs really aren't there. The samples are a little cryptic, not straightforward. It's a little more complex than you would think it is on first blush. And the complexity is around whether you make something client or server side, and from there, whether you include another client side thing or work with more server side stuff. Because it just gets weird. They call it uncanny valley in their examples, in their spec. So the problem with server components, and this was from, I think what Dan Abramoff said this, I think, was that it's getting more uncanny valley when you're not entirely sure whether a component is server side or client side or shared, which means it can work in both, because it hasn't been tainted in a way that says I'm a server. By the way, there's another directive, server only or client only, basically saying you're absolutely only on one side, right? So it's use server, use client as a preference. The only taints it to only work on one side. And that's a lot of stuff to have to figure out. And so until I see really good patterns coming out of the team, that say here are the strategies for, getting the data on the server side and using a client side form, but then making actions on the server side to work. I spent all afternoon feverishly trying to get a demo to work, which I did, that did that. But what I was originally trying to do was do it from the client perspective with some server work. And I kind of had to invert things to get it to function. So it doesn't go as quickly as like when you're first learning React and you start cooking and you get things done. You're like, oh, I started to get the feel for this. I'm sending props down. I'm sending events back up again. I got state. It's more complex than that now. So that's where it gets a little odd. Let me show you that thing. Oh, let me think. Am I on the right one? No. Please stand by while I figure out what I'm doing. There we go. Okay. Is it running? Okay, we're good. We cannot. Nope, it's dev, not EEV. There we go. I'll learn to type someday. 55, I'll eventually get it. All right, here we go. Great front end, right? It's amazing. All right. So React server component, just give me a CRUD screen. That's what I was trying to do today. Let's just get a basic CRUD screen going with React 19 server components in Next.js going against a database. And that's what this does. So in this project, I have a Docker compose file. You fire up Docker, it starts up Postgres, and it inserts 2 rows into a user table. Whoopee. And then I use the Postgres NPM library on the server component to do server-side inserts and queries. So if I do Ken, I'll do my brother here, Mark Rimple. Yeah, there's 2 of us.
Twin brothers.
They're twins, yes. He knows how to make music. I know how to play drums. It's almost the same. That's not an easy set of code to write. A lot of it was non-obvious. I'll show you the code so you get a feel for it. All right, source, app, RSC. So RSC demo is the one. So at the top level, here's my really exciting component here. Let me minimize this and get this out of the way. There we go. I'm still trying to get suspense to work. It should work, but I think it's because I'm just using fetch. I need to use a library that supports suspense. So I have to work on that. And hopefully by the time you look at the QR code and download it, I'll actually have that working. But it doesn't work with straight old fetch, and that made me sad. So I have a server user table here, which is like, managing users, and I have a list in a table format, and I've got a form below it. That's what this component does. The outermost component is the page. Now, I don't know, I can't zoom in here, but that little tiny thing there says page.tsx. It's in a folder called RSC demo. Whoops, oh, that's fun. RSC demo. So if I hit localhost 4000/RSC demo, it'll render whatever is in page.tsx. Page.tsx is a server component. I marked it as such at the top of the page. What I had the most fun with was figuring out how to communicate data back and forth from the top down. I tried loading the data, and one of the children realized I couldn't tell. So when I inserted a new row, I couldn't figure out how to get the whole page to re-render itself to load the list back up again, because the thing I was building was on a client, and that was a server, and I found a hack, which they recommend to do for now, which is like reload the page, basically, which is cheesy. But let's take a look at what we're doing here. So we have a function called load data. It's an async function. It's a promise-based function, and it awaits a function called getUsers. GetUsers is a plain old function. So these are server functions in Next.js. If you mark a file with a function in it as useServer, it can be accessible as a web service. I have a type there for user data, which is just ID, name, and email. That's all that is. Get that out of my way. Thank you. And you'll notice that I'm using a little utility that I wrote just so I don't have to have the code in every script that just uses the PG connection pool. Right? So that's all I'm doing, just getting a connection from a connection pool. I await that. I do a query. Now, would I put this directly in a page? No, but this is a demo. So I would probably bury this somewhere. But just to hack around a little bit, I'm just kind of showing you closer to what we're looking at so we don't jump around a lot. But this page is basically asking this function to go load information from the table. And of course, I'm printing it all out because I'm paranoid that it didn't work for a long time. So this can be at least 4 lines shorter. But, and then once I release the client, I return the rows. The rows are in response. So the response that comes back has a rows property, and that's the rows for the Postgres query. It's basically just a regular old, Postgres database query tool, right? That's all this is. See, I'm turning it back in as this thing called user data. That is my type. I haven't worked out the errors properly. I think it's probably broken that way, so bear with me while I fix that someday. And then, so let's go back to the page. So a server function, or a server component, I should say, starts its rendering process. You'll notice I have no hooks in here. I just run the function. I also make this outer function async, so I can do await on it. So I'm awaiting the load data. It calls this function, which does the call to the network through the PG database connection, comes back with the data, and I turn it into this user data shape. I then return my rendered page. What they recommend is if I'm going to coordinate between multiple components, have a server component pull the data and then pass it through as props into the other things and let them deal with it that way. And that made things so much better. But so basically, I'm passing into the server user table the users collection. If suspense was working, you would have seen this nice little loading, and then when it was done, it would show the table. But you don't see that because it's not working, and it's probably me. The add user form, let's take a look at that form. This is going to be the same as you saw before. This is a form. Okay, so this is a component that has a form on it. All this stuff you can ignore because it's just plain old validations and input change handlers. But the stuff at the top is the important stuff. So we've got our state object for the form, because this is a client-side component. I don't know if I mentioned that, but at the very top, this is a client-side form. So the server component shipped down a table, and it shipped down a form, which is a client-side form, because the form needs to hold state and run hooks, and you can't do that on the server. So the server can send client components down, and that's what it's doing with this case. So I create my state object. I'm using that. I don't know why I'm looking there. I'm using that use transition. So now I know whether it's pending if I want to pay attention to that. But more importantly, didn't mention use transition. So hey, guess what? We should talk about it. Use transition is another hook they created for if you're on a client component for you to trigger a server-side action. So it does the magic that we saw the component do when we had the form with the action. It does that same magic for you for server-side forms. So I can say, client, go ahead and call the backend like an effect. I don't know why they just didn't use useEffect, but probably because it's such a mess to work with anyway. So, because everyone has a bug in a useEffect, right? So use transition will give you a start transition function. And when you want to make something happen, like a submit on a button, which I'll get down to here. Here's my handle submit. I start transition, and I make a call that references the server component. Now, in a lot of applications, those are two separate projects, right? And they have to share types through a third project, probably, right? So you've got a client, a server, shared. Look at the import up here. By the way, that can be shortened. It just decided to give me the full path. But in the same project, it just goes to the top and says, oh, give me server actions, API users, server actions. And that's the file, serveractions.tsx, has the add user function in it as an async function. Right? If I go there, export async function, get users. It also has add new user, which we're going to see in a minute. So we're going to insert as well. Okay. And then the hack is use router. I have to tell it that it's done inserting something and reload the tree. I was trying to figure out how to tell it to do it in a simpler way, but there's basically a refresh on the new router in the app router for Next.js. And that was their hack. They're like, for now, you got to tell the page to refresh itself. I'm like, really? Okay. We validate our input. If it works, we handle submit. We build our shape for the data we're going to send, which is the name and email as a user data object minus the ID, because I haven't created it yet. We do our start transition. Now this is going to hit a server-side component. We do an async call inside of there, and the async call awaits the call to the server component, the server function, basically. It adds the new user, and then when it's done, the hack is to call router refresh. Oh, and by the way, if you really want to drive yourself crazy, spend an hour trying to figure out why you keep getting weird errors about the router that you've used forever, and find out that you're using a different import for router in the app, the new directory structure router, and they didn't tell you that in the error message. So some of this stuff is just painful right now. So if you get anything away from this, I would say there be dragons at the moment learning this new stuff until they really have a true release out there and it's been shaken down. You might want to wait a little bit and just hack with it. If you have an experimental app you want to play with, go ahead. But would I put this in an app that I've been working on for 5 years? Not yet. I'd wait. Just until we know that it's well supported and that it's stable and that people have figured out all the weirdness and they've talked about the patterns you can glean from other people in the community. That's what I would do. But that doesn't mean you have to do that. This means I'm scared. I've done a lot of front end. All right. And again, I mentioned the rest of these things before, so I think we're good. So React 19 is coming. If anyone knows where this reference comes from, you win. Put on your peril-sensitive sunglasses. It's the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy game from 1984. Yep, watch for the news in May at the Meta React conference, see what they come up with. And good luck. But before we go any further, yes, there are still other options. There's a lot more than these, but I think these are the ones that we've been looking at, and probably most of you have been looking at some of the same ones. So Angular itself, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but the Angular framework, they had their NGConf, which I've been to a number of times when I was an Angular developer in Salt Lake City. And they announced that they were working with another team at Google, and that team is called the Wiz team. Now, Wiz is another framework at Google that does like YouTube and things like that. Apparently, it's a Java-based backend, and it's been around for a long time. They made an announcement on X, Twitter, whatever it's called these days, that said, we're merging the teams. We're merging the APIs. And caused a lot of us to go, what? Is React dead now? And when you dig deep enough and find out, really what they were talking about is the Angular team is using a thing called signals. And signals, I guess, came from, was it from Elm? But one of those frameworks. Signals are a lighter weight version of state management, holding data. There is a React version. In fact, I'm going to include in the directory structure, I'm going to give you a sample of some signals APIs to look at. What they did was the Angular team worked and created a signals API, and the Wiz team liked it so much, they integrated Angular signals into Wiz. So that's the real story at the moment. And of course, management is talking to management. They're saying, we should work together closely. So 5 years from now, maybe there'll be one framework. I have no idea. But for now, it's just FUD if you think there's something going on. We really don't know. But Angular's still around, still kicking. Svelte is a framework that a couple of years ago, Vercel hired the developers of Svelte. The main engineer and architect, I think, is the person they hired first. They also hired the Webpack developer and a number of other people. And they helped Svelte with their meta framework called SvelteKit. It's another platform. I have enough platforms personally. I don't need another one until I give up on one. But I've been paying a little bit of attention to it. It's on my list of things to check out. Some people who have used it really like it. I know I've looked at Vue a number of times. We've had a couple of clients use Vue. It's never seemed to take off in the same level that React has, but it has a pretty loyal following of people who use it. So, and they have their own meta framework that does server-side rendering, and that's called Nuxt, N-U-X-T. So that's another option for you. And the one I keep looking at every once in a while and going, maybe I should do a little project in is HTMX. Carson Gross's framework. We've had him on Philly Emerging Tech a number of times, I think twice now. And there's some videos of him talking through that. But it's an attribute-driven, HTML-driven front end that does the JavaScript stuff behind the scenes for you. So you don't have to write a lot of JavaScript to get some basic page automation done. Think of jQuery in attributes, and you get the idea. It's kind of like a lightweight version of that. So if you want a super lightweight alternative, you could look at HTMX. The thing I worry about with a lot of these tools is, are they going to be around in 5 to 10 years? Who are the developers? Are there only 1 or 2 developers? You know, that's when I see something like that, where I see a couple developers, I get a little worried. But it looked like last time I checked the HTMX, there were a lot of people contributing to it. So it seems like it's picking up its head of steam too. But certainly Vue has a lot of people committing to it and working with it. Angular is Angular, and Svelte's the question mark for me. So we'll see long term. I'm not ready to jump and move to another framework. I think if I use React as is for now, I'm happy with it. And you can certainly find other developers who know React and work with them and get started. We might all grouse about what we have in our current React app and why we picked the libraries we did for this particular go-round, but welcome to software engineering, right? Yeah, that's all right. This is all junk. Anyway, there's the QR code. If you want to go, it's just a OneNote folder. I'll put more in it if you wait a day or two. I'll put some more stuff in there, including my samples for signals, for example, with Preact, which is a lightweight React, and React signals, as well as the Next.js repo and the React 19 one with canaries. Does anyone have any questions before we end?
In upgrading libraries, have you seen any patterns to what lives or dies 5 years out?
Seems like a lot of the component libraries die a horrible death because it is really tough to keep on top of something like that, right? That's the one I worry about the most. If someone heavily uses a heavyweight component library, you're stuck if it dies, right? A couple of developers that we work with, they want to do all of their CSS themselves with CSS and JavaScript and build up their own component libraries. And at first you think, oh God, this is going to take forever. But when you see what they're doing, they're only using the ones they absolutely need, and they've generally implemented them before, so they bring along the ones they've done and tweak them for whatever CSS that they're using. So yeah, those are the ones that I worry about. The other ones are, I've been using Redux forever because I kind of like it. It makes sense. It's rational. It does what I ask it to do and no more, unless I add more middleware, right? So for a state engine, it's fine. There are a bunch of other state engines popping up. Zustand is a popular one now, I think, Zustand or whatever it's called. MobX is another one that's been around for a while, and I know it refactored itself once, pretty big changes to it early in its life cycle, but I think it's been pretty stable too. But most people in the React world are really not a fan of doing state-based, like, state engines anymore. They're trying to get closer to, like, can I use just plain old state, and can I use plain old, context for everything if possible? Because then I have less libraries to work with. Can I write my own CSS so I'm not left, in trouble when the CSS framework goes belly up? So,
Makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else over here?
Is there anything interesting to see in the demo with how the client and server components get packaged? Are they all together and just the client parts go to the client, or is it separately so you don't have to run on Node if you don't want to?
Well, separately not running on Node is not a possibility because it is inherently server components on Node. But in terms of packaging, they're code splitting. They're breaking the bundles up at the boundaries. So if you have a bunch of client components for a particular route or set of routes, you'll probably get them bundled together. Probably by each route in Next.js, I would think that would be how that is. If you've got a server component that does a client component, like we saw with that add form, that client component is split as a separate load. Yep. Anybody else? Thank you so much for coming to my talk. I really appreciate it. Thank you.